episode 2. In episode 2, we will discuss good practices within organizations and across industries on how to infuse sustainability into the day-to-day operations. And that begins to get us into, Ashish, a little bit of the sort of best practices and the things that you're seeing within your organization, particularly what you do in your industry. What does good look like? We've talked a lot about the responsibility, but now what is actually happening on the ground? What does good look like?
Yeah, I mean, if I can comment, I come from the supply chain industry, right? So I think there's a lot to gain here in terms of sustainability and the ESG practices, right? The best practices. So I think, again, the idea of sustainability is typically, at least in our organization, broken down to three pillars, right? One is economic, second one is environmental, and the third one is social, right? Also kind of equated to, say, profits, planet, and people, right? I mean, the concept of economic sustainability again focuses on conserving natural resources that provide physical inputs for economic production, right, including both renewable and exhaustible inputs. It's all about maintaining honest and transparent accounting practices and regulatory compliance, and we are very much tied to regulatory compliance because we do a lot of cross-border management of warehouses, transportation, right? And like we are across Europe. Europe is pretty stringent, right? We have EPA goals here to meet as well in the US as well, right? So again, the concept of environmental sustainability adds a greater emphasis on the life support systems. I mean, an example would be reducing the carbon footprint or wasteful practices that we have. There are some studies I think that we have had. I mean, today it's all in the news, media, and even school debates, right? And more often than not, I think even kids are talking about this today. Right, many reports from reputed institutions are being published on climate change highlights the increasingly urgent risks of confronting the global impacts from climate change. As a result, customer demand for corporate responsibility, transparency, and accountability is rising to new heights, especially when it comes to sustainable business practices, ESG strategies, and combating the climate change. So, some of the top five concerns for sustainable or ethical practices that we would like to call would be producing sustainable packaging and products. I think this is very important for us because when we ship tons and tons, millions of packages on a daily basis, right? I mean, when you do that, those are cardboard boxes, right? So how can we optimize it, right? How can we, reuse those boxes, right? How can we, when I say optimization, how can I fill the box to the brim, right, and not leave any tonnage? I mean, use the boxes to capacity, right? And obviously, then the next is basically the shipping aspect of it, the transportation aspects of it, right? How can we optimize the supply chain, right? Optimize or what we call as the routing, the logic in terms of routing. What is the shortest path that a trailer can take, right, to reach its destination, and that would save fuel costs too at the end of the day, right? So that's very important. Again, that's contributing to emissions, right? So I mean, and these are some steps. Those are some goals that we are working towards as Radial, right? Both across North America and Europe, right? We have invested a lot in terms of technology there, right? Again, reducing waste. I mean, there is some manufacturing that is involved, right? So reducing waste is the other big one. And again, committing to ethical working practices, that's key. Again, that's the third initiative that we have. And like I said, reducing the carbon footprint, and also, I mean, respect for human rights, right? I mean, we have a lot of employees across North America, right? And we are part of Belgium Post group of companies too. So overall, across the world, we have 36,000 employees, right? So that's huge, right? Having great ESG practices is very important for us, and that's core to our values. So I think, yeah, that's where I'll leave it at.
No, great insight and interesting kind of perspective in terms of supply chain, which I'm sure, Mark, you'll have some other elements and good practices to put into the conversation there.
Yeah, thanks, Aoife. And I should start by saying I wouldn't want to claim GSK necessarily has the monopoly on best practice, right? So I wouldn't want to claim that, but I can certainly share a little bit a GSK perspective on our key elements, and I think we're proud of those key elements. And I think from a GSK perspective, one thing to point out is that our mission is to deliver a real impact on human health. And so we start from that point. And I think our view is that there's a clear connection between human health and climate and nature, right? And if our mission as a company is to have a real impact on human health, then in a sense, we have to have sustainability as core to our mission, right? Because we can't have impact if we ignore the sustainability element. In terms of the key elements, we think about it in terms of two aspects. One is this idea of net zero impact on climate, right? So that's one of our goals, and I'll come to that detail in a second. The other key pillar that we pursue is this idea of net positive on nature. I think it's naive to sort of have a perspective of, you can't have zero impact on nature, because clearly we're a conversion process, right? We're a supply chain. We take raw materials and we produce those into medicines for our patients. That is always going to have some impact. I think the question is, can you make that impact net positive? And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So coming back to net zero impact on climate, I think very similar to other companies, we think in terms of the three scopes, so scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and we set specific targets relevant to the scope. So certainly on the scope 2, which is the sort of the scope of climate impact that you have from your direct operations, like many companies, we have a 100% renewable electricity target by 2025. When you get to carbon emissions across the entire end-to-end footprint, then we have a reduction piece, and that partly reflects that a lot of those emissions are outside of our direct control. So they'll either be with suppliers that feed into us, or actually our patients, right? So if you're thinking full end-to-end scope, even the emissions that a patient would be responsible for driving their car to the pharmacy to get our medicine, all of those are kind of included in that scope, right? So there we've got targets around 80% reduction, etc. I think if you go to the net positive on nature, which I think gets a bit more interesting, we've then got three elements that we pursue. The first one is water, and I think everybody talks about carbon, but actually water is critical in the sustainability discussion as well, especially for us with a global footprint. I sit in the UK. Now, most people would think the UK is pretty water rich in the sense that it rains all the time, but actually some parts of the UK are very water stressed, right? And so you have to be conscious of that. And if you look more globally, we operate in some very water stressed environments. So this idea of 100% of our sites, our manufacturing sites, achieving good water stewardship by 2025, so a very, very short time frame, and reducing our overall consumption of water is something that we're really focused on. If I look at some of the other elements, we have waste and materials. So we've long had a sort of a zero to landfill waste target, which we achieved. We're now going after things like eliminating single-use plastics by 2030, and also very conscious of the impact that our product and packaging has, right? So really trying to reduce that. And then certainly trying to do general reduction of waste through the supply chain. And then the last one, which maybe is a little bit, maybe it's quite core to a pharmaceutical company, but is this idea of biodiversity. I think the pharmaceutical industry has had a lot of success on the back of biodiversity. So you think about early discovery programs, a lot of the discovery activity comes from natural products coming from biodiverse areas. So I think our perspective is we see the maintenance of biodiversity as critical, because it's one of the places we go to for inspiration in terms of active ingredients to treat disease. So we have a big focus around biodiversity in terms of having a positive impact. So where we operate in our sites, what can we do to enhance biodiversity? And then actually there's quite an interesting aspect which is unique to us in terms of having a responsibility for what happens to medicines as they are consumed and then break down and then pass up through into our water system. And that's that's a whole rich area to have a discussion about, but that's also a very important aspect of how we think about biodiversity and our impact on nature. So I'll leave it there. Really, we think about those two things: net zero on climate, net positive on nature. Those are the two key elements. And I guess best practice would be to have very specific time-bound targets around that.
And as I come to Tsvi, actually, that's incredibly relevant and important. Pharmaceutical industry, gleaning so much from biodiversity. But Tsvi, just on this topic, and thank you very much for that, Mark. What, in terms of good practices, what are you seeing? What are you looking at?
So we are not a manufacturer, so we have limited ways to really affect the overall sustainability. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that at least we deploy a green building design across all of the buildings that we have, and including the labs. I totally agree with Mark that the medicines that are being created and actually the ones that are being used create huge amount of waste that we are trying to control as well. So just a few things that I can mention that also touch a little bit on technology, but I will start with kind of in general. Clearly, the move for paperless EHR and other types of systems and making sure that we don't produce papers anymore, everything is electronic, so we don't print, patients' files. Doctors move around with tablets to put their comments and so on. All of those basically reduce the huge amount of paper being used. Telemedicine by itself and its nature reduces quite a lot of the energy as well as other types of things that need to happen when you don't have people on site. Of course, it's not always possible because we provide treatment, and we also in treatment we are trying to do some things at home. There was an initiative last year that was called Chemo at Home, so you can actually even do that at home. So that's definitely helping from that perspective. In terms of things that have to do, so basically reducing waste that is generated from both the medical devices and medicine, from the foods that we have, as well as construction, by both recycling and compositing is something that is definitely a key for that. Other practices have to do with lighting, for example, moving to LED lighting, and also make sure that we have the programmable controllers, so there is a light in the room only when people are in the room, and you leave the room after a few minutes it shut down by itself. We do the same with shutdown to all of our PCs and other machineries that can be shut down during the night if it's not being used, or even during the day when it's not being used, we move to power save mode. In the data centers, we worked very hard to improve our power usage effectiveness, the PUE number, which was at 1.52 at the time, and it's now about 1.08. And we did it by some combinations of air-to-air heat transfer, as well as two-phase immersion cooling, and some other ways to basically provide the same level of cooling that is needed, but basically by using significantly lower power consumptions. So the plan is across the board, the commitment is across the board, and our patients also appreciate the effort, because in many cases we ask them to participate and contribute their part by reusing some of the things that we have, and basically not just throw everything that we don't have to throw. So those are some of the areas that we are focusing.